Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is like 900 pages.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, who's read that?
Will give people the opportunity to become philosopher kings themselves.
I think the next thing is an AI act. You know, but if we actually
It's laughable, honestly.
It's laughable? I don't know.
Okay,
We're here.
welcome to the third episode of Philosophy of Everything, where today we're going to be answering the question of
Should
you,
vote?
or should you be allowed to? at
Should
least.
anyone be
Should
allowed to
anyone
vote?
be allowed to? And if anyone, who?
And this is a very special day, very timely day to be doing this because the election is happening right this second. I'm actually watching the election happen, and Donald Trump currently has 210 electoral college votes called for him. Kamala Harris is 113.
It's not
Big
looking
time.
good, folks. Well, depending on who you are, it's looking good. I
Freudian slip.
didn't reveal my political biases at all. What do you mean? So basically, this is a hard question to ask.
Yeah.
Or at least to defend from my stance, because I'm going to be defending that you should not be allowed to vote. As always, we take two sides on the question. And
Can I give you a very surprising update that just happened?
yeah, do it.
California.
It's a
Kamala.
blue state. Who would have guessed that? So I think generally democracy is a pretty good thing. Wouldn't you agree? Do you think democracy is good on the whole?
Probably. The thing
People-
that I always hear about democracy is that it's the least bad system.
Yeah. It's actually a Winston Churchill quote. He was like, democracy is the worst system other than all the other ones.
Yeah.
So like, yeah. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about is there another system that hasn't been tried yet that is better than people going out and voting? So there's a couple directions I could take this. The most obvious one, and the one I like the least, is that democracy on the whole is bad and that we should just have a dictator or like an autocrat or someone who we don't have any say in deciding who this person is, and they just run the government. And I think history has shown that that's actually not a good thing at all. I think pretty generally, and you see this in the rhetoric surrounding democracy, people, like I was saying earlier, like equate democracy with good, and for good reason. Like you see economic success as a result of democracy, like lots of things are good things that come out of democracy. And so I think it's good generally, but I do think it's also flawed. There are a lot of problems with it. And so what I'm gonna try to defend is that there's a better system that we should be pursuing, one that is resembling democracy, but isn't the same as what we currently have, and it functions better and solves the problems that we currently see with democracy. And it is called epistocracy, which essentially means people vote according to their knowledge of the system that they're voting into, and people's voting weight is determined by the knowledge they have. So I'm still answering the question in the sense that some people, and this really comes down to how you decide how the epistocracy should work. Some people should have a lesser say in who's allowed to vote, and some people should have a greater say. You could say that some people have no say at all, some people have a greater say. I don't like that as much, but this is what I'm going to be defending is epistocracy. So initial reactions, what's your take on this totally different system where you can only vote if you have knowledge, if there's some like requirement you meet in order to be a more informed participant in the voting system. Otherwise, you have a lesser vote or you can't vote. Initial reactions before we get into the details.
Yeah, well, I think I've been thinking about democracy a good amount.
Yeah.
Just through the process of having to vote, you know? And so I have been thinking about, for a decent while, just the fact that I know so little about what's going on. It's like very hard to understand all of the things that are going on.
Yes.
And I like went through my ballot and I had my friend on the phone, and I realized at the end of the day, like so many people that I picked were just totally arbitrary.
Yeah.
It's like I've never heard of any of these people, and then there's like some races that are unopposed. But I was going through my ballot, and so then what I did, I was like look up the person's website, and then
Yeah.
they said like some keywords, and it's like, huh, interesting. Or like so one guy sent me a piece of mail,
Yeah.
and at Stanford. And I was really upset that he did that, that he
So you didn't
found
vote for
me.
him.
And so I think I may have not voted for him, but that looks really bad on me. But it's also like, what am I supposed to evaluate him on?
Right.
Because the other problem with the candidate, and I think this is like against the whole system, this is maybe against representative democracy, and then instead we should do something like direct democracy. But I think direct democracy is so much worse in other ways.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that you're voting for people that you don't know what they're going to do.
Right.
You know? And so I think there's a lot of natural kind of qualms with democracy. And I want to say this just to kind of amp up why this question is relevant and like why we should consider it all. I think although it's a thing that we're constantly told democracy is good and we're preserving democracy, if you really look at what's upholding it, I mean, it's like so weird in so many ways.
Yeah.
It's weird in the fact that, I mean, just the way that democracy has been instituted in the U.S. with like the electoral system, the electoral college system. So
That's
a certain number of people, or like certain people in certain areas have disproportionate effect. Like that's weird. And just the fact there's only two parties and it's kind of, you have no real choice.
Yeah.
But it's like you kind of have a choice, but you like this illusion of choice. There's definitely problems with democracy, and you mentioned that. And I think even like I feel like I'm relatively well informed, but it's just like so much to know about what's going on and to critically think about what's happening. And then you can always say like, oh, this person's policy is bad or something. It's like, have you read every bill? Like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is like 900 pages.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, who's read that? Like, what am I supposed to read for that? Because maybe it's not relevant right now because it's not in the media as being a relevant narrative about what's going on. But then someday it might come up that actually there is a provision in the page 671 of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that allows for some weird thing that you didn't know about. And it's just so hard to be informed. And obviously you're not voting for that act, but you're voting for the people who are deciding whether or not to do that. And so I think there's a lot of validity to the idea that we should think far more on what a person knows when we're deciding whether or not they should be able to vote.
Yes.
Essentially. And so like, if I'm well informed and still am struggling, like imagine the person who gets all of their news from talk radio.
Right.
You know? And so I think there's like, that's weird, but I think the argument against it is just that, like, as you said before, there's just like not a better system.
Yeah.
And I think people, at the end of the day, they can evaluate outcomes. And, well, you can kind of get into the nitty gritty of outcomes and say, oh, actually this policy was like 1/4 worse than another one. If a person just feels bad in their life, like if the cost of eggs goes up by $1 or $2, then something's wrong.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going wrong. Like, I don't know exactly how to fix it, but like whoever was in charge made this happen.
Yeah.
Now, I think there is a weird thing where people misattribute damage, perhaps. I think this is a big thing with presidents, and is that you get blamed for everything that goes well, or you get blamed for everything that goes badly.
And everything that goes well gets attributed to you. Or if you're opposing them, then it's like, oh, it's just it's
and
not
just like
them.
attribution just like moves so freely.
Yeah,
like
it's a
everything
moving
became
goalpost,
Kamala's problem after
Despite
Joe Biden
being,
went
so
out
real.
of the race. It's like actually she was running the show.
Yeah.
Even though before
she
everyone
was
was
the
like,
VP who has no power.
she's doing nothing.
Yeah.
You know? And so doing anything other than democracy and doing anything other than every person has a vote is just making it so that it's basically just invalidating individual people's lives and saying your experience of what is true and what the world is like is actually not true. It's actually, I actually know how you feel.
I know better. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I agree. Okay.
So
cool.
What do you do with that?
Yeah, so, that's so good. I appreciate that you like leaned into my side a little bit more and helped me out, where you were like, I don't know everything and not everyone knows everything about politics, so how should I be qualified to like vote on this person that I've never heard of, like your experience. But I think there are a lot more turnoffs, like Plato's Philosopher Kings. It was in the heart of where democracy started, and he was like, actually, this is a bad idea. Like, would you let people who are easily swayed by things they have no idea that they're talking about vote for the person who is making the most consequential decisions about all of your lives? It doesn't make any sense to Plato. And so he was like, no, instead you should have a leader who has been educated from a young person and is good-natured and will just do the best things for all these people and just knows what's good for them. And that feels very wrong to people in a modern day sense, because it's like, okay, like then you could just end up with a dictator who does something for their own benefit. And so how do you decide who's the most knowledgeable and the best to make decisions about this? Basically, what I'm going to be arguing is that we'll take Plato's idea of philosopher kings, of people who can become experts on politics and decision making for the general populace, and make it the general populace who's doing it. Instead of everybody, we'll give people the opportunity to become philosopher kings themselves in this epistocracy that I'm going to be proposing. You will have the option to become more well-educated and informed on bipartisan issues and polarizing issues so that you are more of an expert and therefore should have more of a say.
Before you start on that,
Yeah.
could we talk about what you think, or just like, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Just like,
Yeah.
what do you think it takes to be informed? Like, what does it
Yeah.
take to be capable of voting?
Yeah, so that's the thing is like in modern society we equate voting with equality and rights and equalness as a human being and value, when I think that might be a mistake. And that's kind of harsh for me to say, but if you look at like anyone, like dinner table conversations, it's pretty clear that some people know more about specific issues that are relevant to elections, like big presidential relevant elections, and some people who are also capable of voting in your own spheres just don't know as much. And so therefore, I think people that do want to do it and that care about it sufficiently should be the ones with the greater say in what happens. I think it's just logical. There are obvious problems with it, like you end up with like literacy tests, which historically, anyone listening to this is probably aware, but civil rights movement were just used kind of under this guise of epistocracy, where if you're voting, you should be knowledgeable enough of how the political system works to be able to vote. But really, it was just a mask for discrimination.
Because they require people to prove.
Yeah, because they
take
required
some kind of test
people of
in order
color,
to
to take a test
vote.
in order to vote. They didn't require it of white people, funnily enough. But there's this fear that that's ultimately what it turns into, and it's just going to be the educated, white, wealthy elite who have the say in voting, because it's knowledge-based voting. And so maybe you're not representing the people who aren't as privileged and have the chance to vote by removing them from that process because they aren't informed. But basically, to answer your question, I think it takes a lot of time and work in order to be informed, and especially in politics as polarizing as they are. Like, you ask me questions about like one political group that I lean more towards and I affiliate with them, and I'd probably be able to tell you how their stances are on certain issues. But if you talk to me about like the specific policies of the candidate I oppose, I would probably fare much less well, when I don't think that should be the case. I think that I should be equally informed on each of them in order to be qualified to make a decision between the two.
But do you think that the key question is being able to understand what someone's policy is? Or is an election ultimately a decider on what a country believes is important? Because I think there is maybe an argument to be had that people don't know policies well enough.
Right.
But like, is that the fundamental argument here? I feel like the problem here is that you're assuming that there's like something there's like a not knowing here.
Right.
About an election, that
Yeah.
there's like a right answer.
Right.
And that if people are just smarter, then they could just like get it.
Then we would all
But
just
what about
be-
all of the moral questions that don't have clear answers?
Sure.
You know, like abortion rights.
Right.
You know, I think that's not. People are very divided on what it means. Like, you could argue that they're both kind of trying to avoid murder in the end, and they're trying to define where murder is. But still, there's so much disparity on that. And it's like, if you knew everything you could about that policy, do you have some answer on what the right answer is there? Or things like, I mean, climate change is maybe less compelling because I'm compelled by climate change.
Right. But there's a lot of people that aren't, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
But so there are the people who don't believe in climate change. Are they just lacking in knowledge?
No,
Or is there
no.
some kind of
Yeah.
value? It's like, I mean, you could theoretically say, I believe that climate change is the problem, or like I believe that climate change exists,
But I
just
we
don't
should.
think it's a problem, or that I think we should focus on other things.
Yeah.
And I think people, I mean, that's originally what political parties were more focused on as well.
Right.
Like and I think this is still a thing that's happening, is that like the Democrats generally,
Yeah.
in the United States, Democrats are theoretically bigger government. They think that the best way that the government should be responsible for giving services to people.
Right.
Whereas the conservative part, like the GOP, will say that the solution is actually to have a smaller government.
Yeah.
And that it's actually just better that way. Like that's just like a value thing.
Right.
I mean, the priority should be to have a small government.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how you can solve for that by just saying,
Right.
you got to be smart and like know all of the policies.
just gotta
You know,
know
it's like
and
it's not ultimately a knowledge thing.
Right, yeah. And then you'll get the right answer. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is definitely not what I'm saying. I think, but I could see why anyone would think that is because.
What do you mean? What's not what you're saying?
What I'm not saying is that you shouldn't. The issue is not that by knowing these things you'll somehow come to a right answer. I don't think there's any correct answer. But I think that going back to your example of abortion or any of the examples you just picked, if you showed me two voters, one who had no idea what the research was on climate change or that it even exists or had never been exposed to studies that could persuade them that it exists, or had no idea what the Democratic or GOP stood for at all, I think that that person should have a lesser say in what their opinion is about those issues than someone who knows what the literature on climate change is and consciously chooses to not support candidates that would want to combat climate change because they know what they're choosing between, and so therefore they are qualified to make a decision about it.
So just to understand,
Yeah.
you want to make sure you do think that the valuation quality of an election is still something that's worthwhile.
Yes.
But you just want to make sure that the people who are making these evaluations actually know what they're voting for, in that their values are aligned with the candidate and that the candidate is aligned with their values. And that's actually a true link rather than just a perceived.
Exactly. That is exactly it. Because I think there are so many people that, like, you see this where people who, like, to get views go up to people at rallies, be it Harris rallies or Trump rallies, and they ask them about policies of the opposing side or of their own candidate, and they're like a deer in the headlights. They have no idea what they're talking about. They've never heard it. And this is the majority of people. These are the people who care most about going out and voting. Someone I'm going to reference frequently, his name is Jason Brennan. He wrote a book called Against Democracy, which at near the end of it, he sort of becomes an advocate for epistocracy. But he talks about studies where the people who are the least informed about the opposing political parties' views and policies are going to be the ones that are more likely to go out and vote, versus the people that are equally informed of both sides are just going to kind of become apathetic and not really care, which is like the reverse of what you'd want to see happen. What you'd want to see is the people who are sufficiently informed of both sides and really take into account both sides of what's being said are the ones that should like actually have a decision to make, versus what we actually see, which is people just fueling their own confirmation bias and playing the election game like it's choosing your favorite sports team. Like you vote for social acceptance and to stay in your in-group, more so, studies show, than you vote as a byproduct of being informed and making a conscious decision based on policies and what you might actually believe. And I think that's very problematic.
So how do you implement? I
How
feel
do
like
you
that's
implement?
like the problem.
That's the main question.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
I would like everyone to be more informed.
Right.
But I feel like it gets testy when it's like, okay, a poor person,
Yeah.
how are they going to have time to educate themselves enough so that their vote is valued?
Yeah. So I'm by no means a political philosopher or political scientist, but I've thought about this a decent amount, and I think I could propose something that is, at least if nothing else, fun and worth talking about for the sake of, solving the problems that we do see in the democratic system as it exists. But it's really just kind of brainstorming as it exists. So I could present it, but before I do, kind of a preface that I thought was fun and worth including. So Plato, in his dialogues, there's a lot that he talks about. He talks about this world of forms where there's like an ideal version of everything.
Yeah.
And I think that settling for our system as it currently is, instead of, challenging it and brainstorming ways to improve it, is just settling for the version of what we have instead of the idealist form of whatever the political system is. And it might not be what I propose, but maybe just by having these dialogues and being willing to question it, we get closer to whatever that ideal form is, assuming there is a perfect form of democracy. Maybe it is what it currently is, like maybe this is the best it gets, But I would be kind of disappointed if this is the best possible version of democracy. I feel like there might be a better version of a political system.
Who shouldn't be able to vote?
So people
Poor
of
people?
yeah, just
Were you going to say people of color?
No, I was not. Please don't cancel me. Anyone who doesn't agree with me should not be allowed to vote. But actually, okay, so this is just
Anyone who doesn't disagree with you should not be
anyone
allowed
who
to vote.
doesn't agree with me, anyone who doesn't disagree with me, double negative, should be allowed to vote. Think about that one for a second.
Oh
Think
my
about
God.
that. Okay. So this is just a thought experiment. So just kind of bear with me as I propose it to you. And I already kind of explained it to you a little bit earlier, and I haven't really developed it much since I explained it to you earlier.
Okay.
But building on the idea that we should reward people who are more informed about the people and policies that they're voting for, how do we actually implement a system where that works and it doesn't, it's not something that's worse off than what we already have, where you have ignorant people who are voting, but we should just be okay with that. So, because what we want is basically an unbiased way, because obviously today we have all this, fake news and the media from multiple sides that say like exactly conflicting things, and it's really hard to know at all what's happening. So there has to be some way in order for you to make an epistocracy where things are based off of what you know, where your voting power is based off of what you know. You have to have some objective measure of knowing. You can't just have, oh, I watched more Fox News than anybody else, or I watched more CNN than anybody else. Give me the power of voting, because ultimately misinformation is a real thing. What we would want to do is we'd want to know what the policies and ideals and proposals of the various candidates we're voting for are. And we want to have that in writing so that people can understand it coming directly from them, and then be able to prove their knowledge about what the express purposes of the candidates they have options as available to vote for, what those options are, and what they're saying coming straight from them. So what this could look like is sort of maybe a manifesto of the Harris-Walz campaign and the Trump-Vance campaign at the time that they are, I guess, nominated by their respective parties. I don't know. You could do it at whatever time, but basically what they would do is they would make a document or some form of information that lays out the things that they're running on. So one candidate is running on this economic policy and this border policy and these social rights policies, and they're saying that they're running on those things objectively from them. And then you have the other candidate who is running on these things. And then what you can do just with these two entities is, because they're coming straight from them, you can have people who want to be informed of the political process read those things, and then I guess potentially be tested on the knowledge of what those documents say. And this kind of eliminates bias, because it's not a news source who's saying Trump says this and they change the language to make it seem terrible. It's coming directly from his campaign, so you know what he's saying he's going to do, and you know what his opponent is saying she's going to do, and so you're able to make a decision on that, and your knowledge is tested. So I guess
it's a rhetoric test. Do you understand the rhetoric of what someone says?
Yeah.
What if they say different things? They have to have that one thing. And then what if they adjust their
I was gonna ask
their platform over time?
Yeah, like that's the first main problem that comes to mind, is what if they change their mind over time? Like they said one thing in the past and they say something else in the future, and they change what they want to run on. I think that is kind of actually how it does happen. Like right now, what we see is, especially, depending on what side you want to pick, claims that were made in the past, or ideas or documents or projects that people wanted to run on expressly and explicitly at one point are disavowed later. And so what do you do with that? Well, I think this system, where they actually have to be really, careful and considerate of what things they're saying they want to run on, and are held accountable for the things they're saying, is kind of potentially better in a way, because instead of just being able to say at any time, oh, I never said that, or I never was affiliated with this person, they're choosing specifically, okay, I'm going to run on this issue, and I'm going to run on it, like, officially. And then further down the line, You can have the opposing parties release another document that's critical of the other one. Obviously, it's still rhetoric, but at least in this sense, what you're getting is the key core principles of what this person's ideals are, and so if those change later, I don't know. I wouldn't really foresee that happening because in the course of a political campaign, I don't know how much a candidate's proposed policies change drastically in order to warrant totally disavowing something that they were fully committed to at one point. Like there's one thing, which is where Trump just says, or Kamala just says something, offhand, makes a claim, and you can attribute that to her expressed policies or not. But that's different from when it's in writing, it's explicit, it's what they're running on. It's kind of set in stone in a way. And the reason for it is basically just to have voters informed of what their options are. It's not a rhetorical attack on one or the other person.
Okay, so there's a party platform.
Yeah.
And people have to take a test.
Yeah. So
to prove their knowledge of it.
Yeah.
Of every single thing. Or is this like a test you take at school where it's only like some of the things, but you don't actually get tested on every single thing?
Yeah.
Like, how do you choose the things that you don't include? Oh, yeah.
Right.
But also doesn't support guns. He wants to ban guns.
Yeah. Because
we did put that on the test.
Yeah. Because there's a seemingly infinite number of stances you could have on an infinite number of issues.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like a really hard test.
It would be, yeah. It depends like what extent you want it to go to. It's obviously just a thought experiment, and I think if nothing else...
This is a thought experiment? I thought this was your argument.
My whole proposal. So, yeah, I mean, you
gotta defend it.
Yeah. You wouldn't... The thing
Here
is...
at the electiontest.org, we believe that you can do it. You got it.
That's funny. Okay. Yeah. Basically, I don't know. It's hard to defend this because it's... Like I said before, I'm nor economist nor politician. So it's very much just like, okay, like if we had an epistocracy, like how the heck would we actually do it? Like, maybe this makes sense from my intuition models. But yeah, I can keep explaining what I think would work and why I think it would work and what challenges and problems it solves with democracy. But just you have to know that it's just coming from my my thinking of what might work. So yeah, to answer the question about like it's a big test, like do we just test some things? You would want it to be like big ticket items. So like this is like what I want to be known for as a candidate, and if I want my voters to know something about what I'm running on, this is the thing, and this is the thing, and this is the thing. And you limit it to maybe a set number of things, of policies, and you could probably have categories on them. This is kind of the way it works on certain news sites that you find already. Like you can break down the actual differences between Trump and Harris's economic policies, their stances on abortion, all of these things. And you could do something similar with the exception that instead of coming from a news source, it's coming directly from them. And then, yes, how do you test it? So you make this knowledge publicly available as much as possible. You, I guess, would sort of have some systems in place to make it, as accessible as possible to try to combat the most obvious criticism, which is that the uneducated and poor won't be able to access it and, be able to inform themselves. You could hold classes on it and stuff like this. There's so many challenges. Like, who is the one fact-checking these things? You know what I mean? Like, do they actually want to run on these things? Are they actually... Do they have the credibility? You know what I mean?
I thought you said it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's just the fact that they actually said it and they send it to you.
That's a good point.
Like, that's what it is. But then there's still the problem of just like,
or are they going to do
they
it?
could lie about everything.
Because
both parties could just totally lie about what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. And under the system, they would actually be incentivized to lie more in order to.
Yeah, because it's written.
Right. Yeah. So that's.
Or like, what if that happens? But then, like, what if they just start saying things that aren't on, I guess this, I'm thinking like a little bit more practically right now, but
right.
What if they write down a few things that are like not that consequential, but then at their rallies they start adding new things, and then like, does everything have to get updated?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's like, that's different, or like we said that earlier, but.
Right. I guess you could find some practical way of updating it, you know what I mean? Like,
But then would you have to get retested? When's the test?
Yeah, when is the test? I guess it would probably happen in the voting booths. You know what I mean? Like
The test is in the voting booth?
yeah.
And so then you fail, you're disenfranchised on the day of the election?
Yeah.
Can't study?
You can't study. Well,
That sounds like a bad idea. Like,
you're studying.
I feel like you'd want to be able to have multiple times to pass the test. This seems...
Yeah, but with your proposal, I guess what you could do to solve the problem is have the option for updating it and potentially have a cutoff time for when they can no longer update it. Like, they only campaign to a certain point, you know what I mean? And a lot of the things that they're campaigning on are like just repeated messages, you know what I mean? So I guess you could update what their stances are throughout the election to a certain point, and then you don't have like, obviously you don't overwhelm people with knowledge, but that's the thing is like, maybe you do a little bit. Like, obviously there's a certain amount you can know about a candidate, but if you know those things really in depth, like a politician would, or like someone with a deep understanding of political knowledge, like maybe there's some way to like go in depth further into these policies and how they would actually play out and stuff like this. And then, maybe everyone has like a base voting rate of 1, you know what I mean? And so no one's disadvantaged by not knowing these things, so you're still represented. But if you are paying attention to the election, you're rewarded for doing so with some proportional increase in your voting capability. This was actually done in England until the 1950s, where college graduates had 2 votes instead of 1. Everyone else just had 1. They did away with it because it's obviously like just the wealthy, educated people who are going to do it. But but in this system, it's everything we're already doing, where people like watch the news, and so many people care about the news and informing themselves on politics, and taking that knowledge and making it relevant to the decision-making process of elections. What other problems do you have with my system? We can try to refine these.
I mean, I think it has a lot of challenges.
Yeah. The other big problem, unless you had something you were going to say, is that like, and I thought of an answer to this as well, which is why I'm bringing it up, is that people will make the claim that those who don't have necessarily the time, maybe they work like a 9 to 5 and a night job, or they're going to night school or something like that. They don't have the time to get educated on these topics, or like it's they're not good at taking tests or something like this, or just some barriers that would marginalize them. They're going to be underrepresented. And this is a bold and maybe offensive claim, but if you think about it, the people that wouldn't be able to take the time to inform themselves on the election would actually be worse off making decisions about that election for something they have no idea that they're talking about. You know what I mean? Does that kind of make sense? So you're
saying that people who don't have time to take the test probably shouldn't actually vote.
Yeah, because
like that just because that a poor person who can't make the test,
they should still
probably
vote.
Shouldn't be able to vote if they don't have enough time to learn about the election.
They
you
should
just
still
think that they're
vote,
not as qualified.
Yeah. Yes.
You think they should still be able to vote though?
I think they should still be able to vote, like be represented.
But they're probably not going to be
as much as someone who. As I say
feel
this
like
out
you're
loud.
trying to play both sides. You have to take a stance here, you know?
They wouldn't be, I guess you would have to design it in such a way that a poor person, and I hate saying that, like, it's hard to defend. Like, epistocracy, there's a reason that it doesn't exist as it is now, but I think there's some merit to it. I think it's a good idea. But you would want to design it in some way that the ideas are as accessible to disadvantaged groups as they are to the wealthy elite. And so it's just a matter of caring about the political sphere.
It seems like maybe a way that you could solve for this is you just like give everyone a survey on what issues they think are important. And then
they do this.
So
actually.
everyone is included, but then not everyone necessarily votes on how to get that done specifically. But as long as those things are, but then that's kind of just like a different way of voting. But then instead of voting for the people, you vote for the issues, and the only way that those are actually kind of measured are whether or not they're solved. And so then you can create I'll help you.
Yeah,
this
go
is like,
for it. Yeah,
this is a theoretical other system that is not a democracy in the same way, but could include the views of everyone while still being more effective towards those ends. Okay. And so maybe, I mean, an interesting way of doing, I mean, it's hard to do it without voting. at the end. It's like hard to vote. But like theoretically, you could say, give a survey to everyone in the country. Everyone does the survey. This is like the form of voting.
Right.
And they say, I want this to happen.
Okay.
You could just like write down what you want to happen. And then there could be some kind of metrics that are created.
Yeah.
By someone, I don't know who. I guess just
that you like take into account the general consensus of what people are wanting, and then you make decisions.
Yeah,
about
and
that
so
somehow.
you take the things that are majority issues,
yeah.
and then you just make those happen. And
Right.
then maybe every few years you ask, what are the problems that you want to see solved? And then if the problem is still there, that's a problem. But you're like voting solely based on issue, and you're not even saying how necessarily it needs to be solved.
Right.
But because
Yeah.
you maybe don't know how, but you know the problem.
Yeah.
You know.
So the difference between that and an epistocratic democracy, where is that is like you're just kind of subservient to to whatever power is. You know what I mean? You remove the selection process. You're just kind of saying, this is what we want. Like these are the options that we want. Versus with an epistocratic democracy, what you have the option to do is say, okay, this person's obviously going to be a dictator. The general populace has no idea about this. You know what I mean? Like has no idea that they're running on this and this and this and this, and they're obviously going to get into office through their populist techniques of winning the majority vote and then become a dictator. And so in an epistocratic system, you have people who are more knowledgeable of the political system who are able to safeguard against that and say, wait a minute, I actually did some research on the policies that this person's running on and what they've said explicitly they're going to do. And so I have more voting weight, and therefore this potential tyrant is not a tyrant and doesn't just have total control of all the things that we, the people, want to see happen. Versus in that system, which I like it as a system where you're proposing the big issues that people want to see happen. You're kind of losing the choice aspect of it, you know, like there's no voting. But I do like it as an issue. I guess what I'm saying is that it kind of happens just as a byproduct of an epistocratic democracy, where you're making the choices for the people who are going to make the choices, knowing that those are the choices they're going to say they're going to make, instead of just saying, this is what I want to see happen. Does that make sense?
You're making the choices for the people.
You're making the choices to vote for people who say that they're going to make these choices. So basically you're saying, I want these choices to be made with the middleman of a politician, instead of just, oh, I want a better economy. Please, government, better economy. and they're just like, sorry, too bad.
I think it's a pretty good attack on mine.
But yeah, it's so hard because it takes so much meticulous planning and prevention, and you have to consider so many things. What else? What other problems are there with this?
With your system?
Yeah, that I haven't addressed yet.
Well,
what's your biggest issue with what
I mean,
said?
I think this test is just like really...
This test is so arbitrary and hard.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think it's... I think it's just like really hard. It seems really hard to work. Like another worry that I have with it is just... Well, so, I mean, the points that I'm building out here, I'm building a case.
Yeah.
First of all, poor people can't vote. That seems like it's just it's not representing a group of people that seems counter to our values as a society.
I would say, just quick caveat, I would say that while I don't have the best answer for this, I think there would be ways to encourage poor people and make poor people available to have the same knowledge that these people have to be able to vote. Like, I'm not saying that poor people
pay
should...
McDonald's $500 for people,
yeah, like
for poor people to
in the
go
same way
to this
that
class, but then they still might fail. So then, the other problem here, though, is like, why should the test be something that you have to remember? Why is it an open book test? Because like right now, voting is theoretically an open book test.
Yeah.
You know, like especially I had my book open. I was reading the websites of all the people who I was voting for.
Yeah.
Like that was my form of research.
Yeah.
And I just like saw what their issues were. So then basically I'm doing that, like kind of doing what you're saying.
Right.
And I don't know how much that helped me. Like I ended up voting pretty consistently down the line.
Right.
In a certain instance, I was like, I need to vote for someone from the other party just because that seems like what a thoughtful person would do. Yeah, and which is really weird. But
yeah,
I mean, on the bigger issue for the people that I did know, I voted based on the perceptions that I developed over time.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Like, would it just be an open book test? I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because that's, like you said, it's what we actually have. Like, it's an open book test.
Yeah.
Except the problem is there's no test, so no one opens the book. You know what I mean? Like, people never.
The election is kind of the test.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. It's not.
My sense is there's no incentive.
Okay.
There's no incentive to become more informed.
But the other thing about this open note, like this open, or just a test.
You could have it be an actual
being
open book test.
Yeah, for sure. Being evaluated for, like, knowing the thing. I was doing research for one of my essays that I'm working on right now, the essay that I've been working on. One of the things that they talk about, because it's about learning and how to learn effectively, and one of the authors makes the case for two types of understanding. There's like text. First type is text-based understanding, and then the other one was situational understanding. And so text-based understanding is really just like, yeah, I could recognize those words if I saw them again and say, oh yes, that word goes with that one, you know. Yeah. And so it's just like rote memorization that, like, I can complete the sentence. You know, the rock goes up the hill. You know, you fill in those words. And then if you're given the rock goes up, then you'll say the hill. But conceptualizing what that means at all is a different thing. And so I feel like, how is this test also going to be done? Because it sounds like it might end up being more text-based, but the argument for a situational-based understanding is that you should be able to cross-apply that knowledge. So not just know, like, not just be able to complete the sentence, because an unthinking person can complete the sentences for all of a person's party platform, but then they don't actually know what any of the consequences for any of those things would be. You can understand that, Donald Trump says that tariffs will, like, cut down costs for American workers or something, and so you can complete that sentence, but then if you actually knew what tariffs do, you would just see that it's a tax on goods coming from outside, and so then that just makes them more expensive for U.S. workers. The argument for tariffs is, so now engaging it more complexly, the argument for tariffs is that we don't trust countries like China. And so we should incentivize industry to build up in the U.S. And so there's a case for tariffs under that argument. If you do think that we're, like, on the brink of a world war, then maybe we shouldn't be relying on a foreign country to give us those things, especially like with Taiwan or whatever things going on with that. But I think
you pointed out a good flaw in my.
What kind of test is this? Is the test going to be able? How are you going to design? And it's like there's just like so many complexities with that though. Because you do that, and then, like, who's deciding how to make it? Because theoretically, would you say that you'd want it to be situational, like a situational understanding,
more
or just
so
the
than
text-based?
the other option, whatever it was.
Than the text.
Than the text-based.
So the situational seems
it makes more sense.
Better.
Yeah. And so I have a potential answer to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So previously, what I was saying is it's just text-based, where it's like this candidate says they're going to be running on this, this, and this. But if you have no situational knowledge of what those things actually are, yes, you can answer a question on how does Kamala Harris's economic policy compare to Donald Trump's. And it's like this, this, and this, and tariffs, but you have no idea what those things actually mean. You can, regurgitate text about those things, but are you actually a more informed and therefore more influential voter as a result of being able to regurgitate those things? Or are you just good at studying? So most people, I'm actually an exception to the epistocratic theorizers of what this test might look like, where I say that it should be based on candidate proposals and stuff like that. But you've pointed out a very good problem, which is why I think most people aren't this way. Most people are like the people who should have an increased voting power, magnitude voting, whatever scalar quantity their voting are the people that have an actual general situational knowledge of how politics works. So more like a high school civics test, like how is a governor elected, how does econ work, what are tariffs, stuff like that. So I guess my answer to this would be yes, you keep the previous aspect that I was talking about, where you have from the horse's mouth, the candidate is saying they're going to do this and this and this. And that is, knowing those things is one thing that could get you potentially a higher voting quantity by knowing those things. But I think also you would want to implement the things that you're talking about, which are someone who understands how these policies compare and what implications that has on international policy and what tariffs actually mean and stuff like this.
But how do you do that? Because then you have to just know about everything. And how long is this text? Is this task? Is it going to include like, oh, actually, tariff? And then who's writing the
who's objectively writing this and
that's saying,
no bias.
oh yeah, if you invade X country, then this is going to happen. According to who? Like things happen. Surprising things happen all the time.
Right.
Which is why I feel like there's an argument, like another way to argue for democracy is just this weird, I feel like it's just this weird principle of when things are really complex, the solution might just be to avoid all of the complexity, because of getting into the complexity just skews it one way or the other. Like a survey, a weird thing about surveys is that if you survey, you have to survey like 5% of a population or less. Or like some percentages or less. But then if you start getting like 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, that's like theoretically more complex, but then it becomes less representative. Because there's like, who are the people who haven't been surveyed?
Right.
You know, and so like I'm trying to connect this to say that trying to build out a more and more complex test, which it seems like is the direction you're going in, it just makes it harder and harder to understand, like to keep it unbiased on like where are we going and why.
Right.
And so I think the alternative to that is going back to like the simplest thing, which is like, I mean, democracy or like a betting market. And I think it's interesting because the betting market, you've been able to bet on the presidential election on these like crypto betting markets this election, and they've been voting. They've like all said that Trump is going to win. Big odds for Trump, positive odds like 70-30 or something, and it seems like Donald Trump's going to win.
Yeah.
I mean, we still haven't seen some of these swing states, but Donald Trump is doing well.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the polls even were saying it's like 50-50 in a lot of these places, but then New York Times says it's 89% chance of victory for Trump right now.
Right.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I guess you bring up a very good point, which is the more complicated or the more in depth you try to create answers to these problems that indefinitely arise as you try to build this proposed system, you're actually just creating more problems for you to solve, and it just gets more complex, and there's just an increasing amount of objections to the system. I guess I could bring this to an end point. I could like sit here and keep being like, okay, well, some aristocratic philosophers are like, what if we got a group of like 500, like a sample of 500 random civilians, like just general public people together, similar to jury duty, and they were the ones that are like, okay, yeah, like now that I'm educated about this thing about econ and this thing about international law, this should be in the widely distributed document that we give to people, or this is what the test should look like, and they get together and they design it. And so that way it's kind of a representative sample. Ultimately, what you're going to end up with is more problems of like, okay, now we have this document, like how do we make it available? How do we address candidates' objections to what the document says, if they have any that arise later? Like genuinely so many more problems. But what I'm going to say is this. I think the argument that going back to the simplest thing, the thing that we know works, which is democracy, it's worked for a decently long time, and a lot of other countries, like a ton of other countries, whether they're democratic or not, are trying to replicate the system because you see so much success with it. But I would actually maybe make the case that the argument that just staying with what works is what prevented for history and civilizations for so long from evolving to a democracy, something that is better than what they had before. because democracy has all these problems. Like you have a captain steering a ship chosen by a group of ignorant people is Plato's argument, and you have a total history of people that are like a cunning and good leader like Machiavelli's prince is just the best option we have, and just a good benevolent philosopher king is just the best thing we have, or a monarchy or something like this. An entire like majority of civilized human history that wasn't democracy, that potentially could have made the jump if it weren't for hesitations to solve the problems that inevitably arise. And so maybe these problems aren't actually worth addressing, and whatever Plato's form of the ideal form of elected government is what we currently have. But maybe it's not, and maybe the next democracy, like the next universal good thing, is worth taking the time to sit down and actually flesh out. Yeah, should we just stick with democracy? Is it worth trying other things?
I feel like following Occam's razor
Yeah.
in this case. The simplest thing might be the best explanation.
Yeah.
And I think... I don't know. I don't think I'm convinced of your
Epistocracy.
case of epistocracy.
Me neither, honestly. But I
but
my
I
best.
appreciate your valiant effort in trying to defend it.
Of course.
I think democracy. Honestly, I think I've been thinking. I've challenged internally democracy for a little while.
Right.
And just like seeing the world, it's surprising the things that happen. But I guess the hope is that it'll work in the end.
It has been, so.
It has been.
Pretty well.
Yeah. I don't know. I think democracy at the end of the day is just limited by people. And people are very limited.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. And people do things that are not in the interest of others because they're selfish.
Right.
And they destroy the planet and buy too many things and put trash and stuff into the rivers and the water sources because they just don't really see the problem. And there's just like all of these developments. And I feel like democracy is fundamentally linked to those benefits and those burdens. And I don't know. I feel like I wish you argued for something that was less democracy because it was still
I guess
democracy.
I could have. Yeah,
because
I still can.
I still think there's an argument that we're just like making the wrong decisions,
Throughout history, we have had people like, this benevolent dictator in Singapore who's like a good person in getting things done. Or in Saudi Arabia, I guess I heard from a friend that there's this crown prince who is doing great things for the country and the economy, and people are pretty stoked about it. And if you look at history, like you have similar things like Marcus Aurelius and different like great Persian leaders. I forget their names, but like people who are known for being incredibly good and incredibly unifying. And you could argue that you get rid of this divisive indecision where nothing gets done as a result of just having good leaders. But the reason I ultimately didn't go this route is I think you run into many more problems, like a whole host of new problems as a result of like essentially leaving your will up to chance of who's going to be my philosopher king who claims they know what's best for me. And
it is interesting how democracy, I don't know, do you think democracy feels permanent? Because it hasn't been around that long.
Right. It's like pretty new, actually, in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, you should find. I don't think it is. I don't think it does feel permanent.
Okay, like 2,500 years.
Yeah, because Rome.
This is Athens.
Yeah, and then I think Rome had some elements of it. Maybe not. You could actually make a case that democracy is not permanent because it's flawed in the ways that epistocracy would solve its flaws, where we are at risk of the tyranny of the majority choosing someone who is totally unfit, and then democracy is upended because of its own virtues, which are actually its vices. And so I could see a convincing argument made for epistocracy being the next evolution of democracy, which makes the good parts of democracy more permanent. But I guess history might have shown that democracy maybe isn't permanent.
I think the next thing is an
AI-ocracy.
Yeah.
An open AI-ocracy.
I think that AI could theoretically become a better governor, like create better governance
Than people.
than us.
Yeah.
And in like a very
Actually?
and totally.
You might have a
Like
point
I
here.
read this article today.
Yeah.
Like I read the headline and it said
I read the headline. This is real news, folks. This is...
it said that AI is maybe smarter than humans. Here, let me see it. Or behave. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Study finds ChatGPT's latest bot behaves like humans, only better. This is from Stanford. Human Science, School of Humanities and Science. The most recent version of ChatGPT passes a rigorous Turing test, diverging from average human behavior chiefly to be more cooperative. So,
That's actually so worth exploring.
I
and
think
interesting.
I've been saying this for a long time. I feel like it's just like uncomfortable, you know. But if we actually
It's laughable, honestly.
but just laugh. I don't know. I think you think about
it
that
is.
thing where
Yeah.
it's like what I was saying before, where you write down all the things that you want to see happen, and then
Yeah.
or you even just like get some kind of. I mean, with Neuralink, we're understanding more and more. I think this is the ultimate. Let me cook. With Neuralink, we're understanding more and more what humans are thinking
Right.
and what that thinking means and kind of how it could be optimized.
Yeah.
Theoretically, like right now, Neuralink is just used to move a cursor around a screen, but we can read. Well, the big point here is we can like read people's minds,
Right.
and we're interested in increasingly being able to read people's minds. And so, if we can read people's minds, then we can see their satisfaction, and you can also look at like broader life quality assessments, like the climate, and looking at other threats to
Correlate them.
humanity, and who's going. I think the biggest problem about democracy just in general and just people governing is that we're so bad at governing in a properly weighted sense because we have to simplify everything so people can understand it. This was an example of this is this subsidy for electric cars.
Okay.
So I saw this in one of my I love this school.
This is a good school.
I saw this in my class the other day. They were talking about this guy does economic policy research, and one of the things that they were talking about is like the EV tax subsidy in the it might be the Inflation Reduction Act, it might be the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
I've heard about it.
But what it was is it was like a $7,500 or something credit for a new electric car. And so that number is like nice and easy. And so everyone thinks, all right, $7,500, I'm going to go get my electric car.
Yeah.
But the problem is not every electric car is the same. The cost, because what they do is they evaluate all of like a total cost for how much an electric car is going to cost. And they put everything in terms of dollars. And that also includes like suffering and other things. So they quantify everything. So they'll take like the likelihood or the increased likelihood of death.
These economics researchers?
Yes, yes. In evaluating like what the subsidy should be.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the idea is you're trying to obviously reduce carbon emissions by having people drive electric cars. And so they'll quantify like what the actual emission savings. So to buy an EV, there's not actually that much saving. It's more carbon output from producing the car because batteries are carbon intensive, but there's no new CO2 other than from the power generation when you actually have it. And so theoretically, like a lot of the power generation right now is still like gas and coal. But increasingly, there's more renewables that are fueling when you go to the supercharger.
Right.
So it ends up being okay. Basically, so they add in all of these different things, and they include like the cost of death, or like the increased likelihood of death because they're like bigger, heavier cars, and then the wear on the road, which is the cost, and the cost of the environment, and the actual cost of the car, all of these things.
Right.
Put it all together and say, okay, this is worth this. But then the problem is that may be true for a mid-level SUV.
Right, but not
But
for,
when you talk about a Rivian,
yeah.
those are like huge, and they have a huge, like four times or something greater environmental impact.
Right.
Just for the materials that go into that
Yeah.
to get enough power to pull it, is like 4 times more than a Prius.
Okay.
And so then the question in class was like, why don't you just give a lower subsidy or no subsidy for the Rivian,
Right.
and give the subsidy? And so like the Rivian is worse than a lot of gas cars.
Really?
When you're evaluating like the big
wow.
Rivian. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but that's like a hard to contemplate nuance.
Right.
Because the more that we have complexity in our world, then the harder it is to make clear decisions. So this is
Okay.
coming back to the AI.
Right.
Because the AI can just make this decision super easily and you don't have to think about it. Whereas the policymakers are going to make something that, and so like the AI could just implement very easily. If the AI just has more and more control over everything, then it could just very easily implement, all right, this car is actually going to cost, you get this subsidy because it has this effect on the environment. And I mean, maybe that's like a weird example, but right now our policy is largely designed in a way that just like, it overcorrects, overcorrects, but we really want it to be perfectly corrected.
Yes.
And the system that we have right now, where it has to be voted in like omnibus bills, just like super complex, all of these random things that are like no one's totally on board with, but all right, we got to do this for my constituents and this and that. We end up with just weird things. As the minimum wage goes up, like the minimum wage should just be tied to inflation theoretically, or like maybe we shouldn't have a minimum wage. But it's weird. But if we had AI governance, then they could perfectly weight all of these things theoretically, and AI is already showing some ability to do this.
Yeah.
And so I think
it's very interesting.
I think the technological future could solve for like all of these problems. Now, of course, with this, you come with a lot of other problems, like what about all of my liberties?
All of my freedoms.
Yeah, what
that?
about the control I have over my life and my autonomy?
Right.
Like you're going to lose that. And so then you get to these questions, you're just like, what do you actually want from life?
Right.
Do you actually care about ending climate change or like ending suffering and poverty and things like that?
Getting too deep.
Or do you actually benefit and like live to have the problem?
Can I respond to a few of them?
Sure.
Really quick? Okay, that got really deep there. That's crazy.
That's great. Isn't that what this is for?
This is about this. I loved it. I loved every second of it. Okay. My initial thought when you were starting to talk about AI governance, I was like, okay, like that is exactly playing into the, what's it called? Epistocracy argument, which is the thing, be it human or I guess new option, AI, with the most knowledge should be the thing most qualified to make decisions about our life. And so I was like, oh wait, yeah, by epistocracy knowledge, AI should be it. Like AI should be the thing making all the decisions. I will say, kind of like you brought up, and then at the end, I think if we get to the point where AI governance is actually a realistic possibility, which I kind of am doubtful that it ever will be, we'll have a whole host of other problems to deal with. Specifically, like you talked about with the economics study, like sure, maybe AI would be capable of making those comparisons between vehicles and stuff like that. But what's convincing to me is that it was economics experts that were doing that study. Like, we're not at a place, at least right now, where AI can just be like, okay, like figure out how these cars work and give me an estimate on what the subsidy should be. Like, it's experts, it's not AI right now. I think, despite whatever the Stanford article might say about how AI is just outperforming us, I think that human expertise still is running circles around whatever AI could produce. And I think the reason for that is because, I mean, I'm not an AI person, but I'm in a place where I kind of learn by osmosis. I've said that multiple times now, by all the AI people that are here. And it ultimately comes back to like what the AI is trained on. And so, you know, if we're just limited in what we can train it on, and if we wanted AI governance, that would be another big issue, which unless you had some like fully sentient higher AI that was also somehow fully objective, then people would always be upset about what the AI was being trained on. You actually see this already today where certain unnamed intellectuals will will be pretty upset with how AI is just woke and how it's being trained on all this woke internet data from things like Google and this leftist mob of anyway. My point is that I think we're very far from AI governance, though I do think it's very interesting and in line with the postulates or goals of epistocracy, which is knowledge, knowing what is best should be what guides us instead of just people who have vote on vibes or whatever. What else was I going to say about this?
Well, I guess that's the question of how far technology will be able to
Right.
go. And I think that's a big question with AI is like, has it reached, it looks really good and it got really good really fast.
Yeah.
But are we like hitting the point? If you just go to the fundamentals of what AI is built on, it's just like reading things and interpret. It's like fundamentally pattern recognition and prediction.
Yes.
And so if you're just pattern recognizing and predicting, how well are you really thinking? Are you ever able to actually get from like first principles to reason in a meaningful way?
Right.
It kind of seems like it has, though. And there was a really
it
interesting podcast from This American Life where it's like they were talking to the people at Microsoft who were testing open like ChatGPT when it was in early versions. I mean, what they did was they asked questions that no one has ever asked. So they were like, if you had 6 eggs, 1 human fingernail, a book, a briefcase, and a shoe, how would you stack them? It's like no one's asked that
Right,
before.
yeah.
But so like ChatGPT 3 or something, 3.5, answered and it was like, didn't really make sense. And it was like, put the book on top of the eggs.
Yeah.
But then ChatGPT 4, I think,
Yeah.
it used logic, essentially. And so it's like, well,
Some reasoning
we
capability,
should,
yeah.
you should, because the eggs would crack if they were under too much weight, you should put the book, the heavy item, under the eggs, and then the fingernails on the top. And so it thought about that. And so, like, maybe that gets at some deeper thing about how we think, too, in that we're not actually, like, fundamentally this consciousness that's escaping and like making decisions.
Right.
We're actually just pattern recognizers too, and so we've actually just figured out we've done it.
Yeah.
Or like maybe we can do it better because they can just retain all data possible. It's a really interesting question, but we are headed. I believe that we're headed in the direction of AI governance, but if it's limited, then maybe it'll be delayed. But eventually, it seems like we're going.
Do you think in our
direction.
lifetimes?
I think, yeah.
I'm
I think-
gonna call my shot right now and say no.
There's been AI. People have run for elected positions as AIs.
Really?
Yeah,
That
Like
blows my mind.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
yeah. And there's people behind it, but
Okay.
it's just like I'm running this AI, and whatever the AI tells me, I'm just doing.
Yeah. And they just run that way. And
yeah.
so it's effectively
and so they haven't
just,
won. They haven't won a
yeah.
position yet, but how
Who
long
knows?
until they do? Like, there's
Yeah.
weird people who win positions.
I could see that actually being a thing, is like an AI optimized for like the best possible political consulting, and link
Right.
that to a candidate.
Yeah, I mean,
could see
how
that. I
often
think
do you
that's
ask
realistic,
an
yeah.
AI to tell you what to do with your life? I do it sometimes.
I don't trust them very much.
I do it sometimes,
should
and I
do it more,
take
yeah.
consideration
Yeah.
to it to sometimes.
I think
to some
increasingly
extent.
I will. Like as much as, probably surpassing as much as I do it to Google, I will do it more so with AI. And then as they get more specialized, people will just do it
Right,
in whatever
right.
capacity
Because the
their
thing
life
about an
is,
AI
whatever
is
profession.
Theoretically, the ideal AI can be just talking to the smartest, most well-read person in the world.
Yeah.
And then they're giving you advice.
Yeah.
Because right now you look up something on the internet, it's like some random
You have to figure it out.
35-year-old
Yeah.
who like has some thoughts on
some thoughts.
X thing, and you read their blog. And you're like, okay, I guess like
So,
I could follow this.
yeah. Right.
Or you could get hyper specialized,
specialized.
hyper informed information from ChatGPT. And ChatGPT also has a memory, so it
Yeah.
can know everything about you
it
theoretically.
can have
And
your own
if we tag in, you sequence your genome, which my brother got his entire genome sequence for like a couple $100 or something.
That's so,
And
and with brain imaging
with
too.
brain imaging
Yeah,
and-
brain imaging is advancing to the point where we
and
can map it.
Neuralink?
Yeah, and Neuralink, yeah.
It could just give perfectly optimized. I think it seems like we tend to move in the direction of science fiction.
Right.
And science fiction, and I think the other thing about science fiction is it gives the vision for people to develop towards. And
Yeah.
I tend to think that we're going to end up in the sci-fi reality.
You're convincing me.
Big questions, but
Descartes.
anyway,
himself.
should you be able to vote? I guess for now, yeah.
For now, yes.
But
who cares
AI
about
governance
dictatorships?
coming soon.
Who cares about democracy and
Well, because it
epistocracy
solves all the
when you have
problems.
AI governance. It does,
It solves
yeah.
all the problems of like unoptimized.
It creates
Other than
so
maybe-
much bigger problems. But
The-
yes.
The problem is just it can become so potent and could overpower humans.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you want to give that up? And so then the question is, do you want to live in a flawed human world or do you want to live in a perfect AI world?
I guess that is the question, yeah.
But then is it really perfect if you're not happy?
It's probably, yeah. I guess the closer we get to a perfect AI world, maybe the worse it gets. Or maybe the better it gets until it all plummets and then it's just terrible. So we want to get to the asymptote and then just stay there for the rest of the time,
right,
even though we
right.
can't know what
you
that
want
is.
to stay in the imperfect world.
Yeah, Plato's
Forever.
forms. Yeah, Plato's forms is AI governance, and
It is.
and just idealistic.
seems so.
Except, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, although then it's not humans. So then is it intrinsically bad because it's out of our control? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Whether we created it.
So many questions.
So many questions.
We'll
But
keep
I think this
answering
was a
them.
great
Yeah,
discussion.
this
It
was a
lot
good
of
time.
fun.
I think we challenged some ideas and gave some insights, and I learned a lot of things.
Yeah,
Speaking for myself.
and since the election, and since we started the podcast, it's been a few hours and a couple hours. And now Donald Trump has 230 electoral votes. Kamala Harris is 210. My friend's
Is
Senate
Pennsylvania?
candidate lost.
Oh my gosh.
Tough
Tragedy.
time,
Has
tough time
Pennsylvania
for
been
him.
decided?
Pennsylvania has not been decided by but Donald Trump is winning. It's 88% of votes are in, and Donald Trump is winning 51% to 48% in Pennsylvania. Michigan, Donald Trump's winning by 6 points with 56%
My
in.
goodness.
I think Donald Trump's going to win,
It looks like it. Well,
which is surprising.
unless something big changes. And
I guess for a lot of people,
Yeah.
that really only reflects the people I spend my time with probably.
Yeah,
But I
that
think
it's
that's
surprising to you.
Because I think
Yeah.
a lot of people would be like, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Like you go into, I went to the review and everyone thought they.
Yeah. In all of my previous spheres, I would have
Yeah.
not been surprised at all that Donald Trump was winning. But now here at Stanford, it is very surprising.
Right.
What else was I going to say?
But
don't
I think
recall.
we'll be okay.
Yeah. So big updates on the election.
I guess we trust in democracy for now.
We trust in democracy for now. Another big update is I'm still vegan. So for all of you
Still
following along,
vegan. Yeah.
I'm still convinced.
Yeah.
Anyway,
All right. Well, thank you. Thank
See
you for
you.
joining us.
see you next week.
We'll see you next week for a big question, a more practical question.
What is the question?
Coming soon. You'll
Coming
see it
soon.
when it's there.
You will be so excited. Maybe
It's-
maybe you've already watched it and you're just backtracking. But
Yeah.
you'll like it, whatever it is.
Yeah,
Or you already did like
You
it.
already did like it, or you hated it, and you're like,
Or you hated
shut
it.
up, you
Stop
idiot.
talking.
That
you're
was a
still
bad
watching,
episode, but I listened to this one anyway because I wanted to see a good episode.
So who's really winning here? It's us.
That's
'Cause you're
exactly
listening.
right. So, all right, until then,
What's
keep
our outro?
thinking.
Keep thinking. Think about it.